Hello, my name's Oliver Pickup. I'm a technology and business journalist, and I'm delighted to be hosting this session. Our exam question is, how is innovative technology enabling better management of fire risk and empowering communities? And we're going to be looking at what the current fire safety landscape looks like at the moment, what's driving change and innovation in the fire safety world, and then we're going to be looking finally ahead to what the future might bring. So I'm delighted to be joined by Jason Avery, Assistant Director for Prevention and Protection at Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service, Paul Cook, Interim Health and Safety Manager at Ealing Council, Sarah Stevenson-Jones, Vice Chair of the National Social Housing Fire Strategy Group, and Nick Rutter, Co-Founder and Chief Product Officer at FireAngel. So first of all, we'll look at the current landscape. What does the landscape look like for social housing, for housing associations in the fire safety world? Sarah, if we could start with you, please.
Thank you. Obviously, since the Grenfell fire, we've been in a period of very dynamic change within the sector, and I think that's going to continue for the next few years as well. We have seen significant change both culturally and from a system and technology perspective, with a lot of new systems coming forward in the market, which has been great to see as an enabler for change. And I think that's going to be driven further as well over the forthcoming years by the Building Safety Act introduction as well, hopefully by 2023. What I foresee for the next couple of months or years even is further adoption of those systems. But I think at the moment there's a bit of barrier to change and adoption of new technology from housing providers. Partly due to not having a clear understanding of what's available in the marketplace, and also the benefits that the systems can offer and drive within the organisation. And there's also the ongoing financial pressures as well within the social housing sector. We're dealing with obviously lots of issues around cladding systems at the moment, as well as spending a lot of capital in relation to improving general fire safety improvements across the stock. Also within context of further pressures on supply of housing, and I think to some degree that's preventing a level of adoption that we would all like to see in the sector of new tech that's coming forward.
Well, if we look at the numbers, I think they came out a couple of weeks ago. There were in the UK 529,000 or thereabouts incidents which were attended by fire and rescue services. 40% of those were false alarms. But there were just under 250 deaths, which is that's been the level for a few years now. But Jason, I mean, if we consider how rapid, how much has improved in the last 20 years, it's quite important to reflect on where we've come from, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. The change in a number of regulations and furnishing regs and such like have made homes a lot safer. The type of fires that we tackle are different, and we've had to keep step with that. We'll always want to prevent those fires in the first instance, of course, and as such, emerging technology enables us to have better insight into what communities are like and how people behave within their own home environment. And that's an area that we don't regulate directly, and maybe with future changes in some of the legislation, we'll have some increased powers, but not beyond the threshold. And so we're very interested in how we influence and educate communities and individuals that are vulnerable from fire about adjusting their behaviours. And I see the emerging technologies as a way of us understanding those behaviours within communities so that we can make an earlier intervention and make those people safer.
And Paul, from your perspective, I mean, how would you assess the landscape?
I think post-Grenfell we've created this, or a culture of compliance has been created, and that's driven a lot of organisations to do stuff without necessarily giving them the bandwidth to think about longer term. And we talked earlier about smoke detectors and things. The quick fix is to go out to buy some smoke detectors and install them and do what we've always done, to tick a box, to produce a certificate, to report to a board that we've achieved a number. It's a very binary thing. When actually what we need to do is to pause and to look at the strategy, how we're going to this holistic approach to safety in people's homes, safety and comfort, and I think create the space to invest in this stuff and really reap the benefits of it. I think it's conflicted at the moment. Obviously, as I say, resources are tight. There is this this want to get on and prove that we're keeping people safe, and it's a little bit counterintuitive, I think, at the moment.
Nick, if I can come to you now, I mean, how tell us a little bit about your technology and the products that you're offering, and maybe the conversations that you're having. Hopefully, they're easier than they were, I don't know, 5 years ago with housing associations.
Yeah, I think the type of technology we can offer into this sector at the moment is our IoT, FireAngel connected technology, and the benefit of that type of technology is it provides this insight which Jason's mentioned as being so important in order to know how to react. And I think, you know, a combination of factors, but one in particular is that all organisations are stretched. That's true across the world. And systems that just provide lots of data and lots of information aren't the answer. What you need is to provide insight which can drive action. And the type of AI-driven predictive technology we've focused on actually provides that insight and gives housing organisations that stratification of risk, so they can use their resource most effectively by pinpointing where it's needed greatest. So it's actually allowing them to work more cost effectively.
And Jason, if I could come back to you, give us an idea of the kind of the most exciting innovations we've seen, let's say in the last, I don't know, 2 decades. Not IoT specifically, but maybe about sort of compressed air foam and how that's changed.
Yeah, certainly. I've served 27 years in the fire and rescue service, and you know the conventional firefighting medium that I grew up with, throwing lots of water on big fires, certainly changed, and you know that's been driven by a number of factors around you know impact on the environment, new technology emerging. So there's compressed air foam systems, for example, that use very small amounts of water, which means that the collateral damage, if you like, after a fire is reduced. We have ultra high pressure lance systems now, which can literally cut a hole through a wall and penetrate into a fire compartment without us having to put our firefighters into 700 plus degree fires. So technology has been harnessed by the sector, certainly in terms of equipment and the advancement of breathing apparatus and personal protective equipment. It's just really exciting now to see, before the incident, in the world that I work in that prevention arena, that technology is now driving new ways of us delivering service to communities and making them safer. And as I said earlier, really understanding risk in communities. And I was really glad to hear Nick mention about stratification of risk, which sits within the National Fire Chiefs Council's approach to a person-centred framework, and absolutely understanding those different vulnerabilities. And harnessing the technology in conjunction with that real understanding of communities means that we can be far more proactive in our interventions, and I mean that in a prevention rather than a response environment.
Yeah, I mean that's the sort of the golden ticket, isn't it? And from a housing association perspective, Sarah, what are the kind of most interesting bits of tech that are coming onto the market that we should know about?
I think it's been mentioned, the Internet of Things, I think, is really delivering some great benefits for some organisations. It's slowly taking off, I think, in the sector at the moment. We're seeing systems around self-testing of life safety systems, emergency lighting, detection systems, AOV, which is obviously helping organisations deliver operating cost savings, but also providing some sustainability benefits, because we're not seeing the traditional approach about a man in a van going to every building within the portfolio and having to do a flick test on lighting, for example, on a weekly basis. We're also seeing some developments in relation to asset tagging systems as well, which I think, as we move into the commencement of the Fire Safety Act next year, and there's the ongoing responsibility for housing providers to start to inspect and audit the performance of things like fire doors and fire seals. I think, again, that will help improve data and help us, even though I agree about the terminology of compliance, but also help them to demonstrate compliance with our statutory duties. So I think those are kind of like the two key areas that are really starting to change how we manage buildings effectively.
Paul, I know that you've sort of invested in FireAngel systems, but is there a sense, you were saying about compliance, this sort of risk-averse attitude, is there a sense that there needs to be a bit of a mindset shift, do you think? And are you sort of now able to demonstrate to people who are in a similar position to you the benefits of committing to this technology?
Yeah, I think the obvious benefit from it, I think, is the predict, is the algorithm, and for us, it does enable us to start to identify the most vulnerable people in our communities, and in turn, that will start to drive those person-centred risk assessments, those personal emergency evacuation or evacuation rescue plans for those people in their flats, and all of this is a bolt-on, if you like. We still needed to put the smoke detectors into those properties. This is an added benefit that we've gained from it, and I think when we start to mature and we're able to take the data from those systems and the self-testing emergency lighting, the boiler systems, the utility consumption data, we start to get a really, really good picture of how people live, how they use our homes, and ultimately how we can target the limited funding that we've got and resources that we've got to make improvements to those.
And I mean, is there a sense that there's almost there hasn't really been a catalyst? I mean, okay, Grenfell, of course, but is there a sense that perhaps people have done things just the way they've always been done, Nick, and they need to kind of have this mindset change?
Yeah, I think organisations, particularly when anything's related to safety, they want to make sure they're compliant, and doing anything out of the ordinary they often feel as being a little bit daunting. And I think with particularly IoT technology, as soon as you say the term IoT, a lot of housing associations would associate that with high cost. Actually, if you look at a deployment in a holistic way, in the way that we've worked with Ealing, and you're looking more broadly than just fire safety, but elements like the domestic environment as well, what the savings will be from an operational perspective, and you structure install correctly, it doesn't have to be hugely expensive. In fact, in the case of Ealing, we did it within the existing budget. So it's actually understanding the technology that's available and how that can help you be compliant today, but also when the fire safety environment is as dynamic as it is in the UK today, to ensure that you're future-proofed.
And we're going to talk about what's driving the change and innovation in the fire safety world. We've talked a little bit about it now, but to what extent did the Grenfell tragedy, how has that changed things, if at all? I mean, obviously there's legislation that's come in, but Sarah, I mean, has it changed things enough, do you think?
I think there's still work to do, but I think the most significant change that Grenfell had on the sector was not, yes, of course, looking at the built asset, but I think it's an understanding that we need to know as a responsible person for fire safety in a building more about the people that live within the property and the risks that they have to manage on a day-to-day basis. And we certainly need to improve the general data that we have about the building, the people living in it, how the building operates, what it's made of, how it's constructed. And I think that was the biggest wake-up call that Grenfell had, is that most organisations didn't have that golden thread of information about their building and didn't really have a clear understanding of the people that live within the property and the risks that they pose to themselves and others within the building.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And Jason, I mean, I'm guessing that you might agree, but it's Grenfell perhaps hasn't changed much in terms of driving technology, but that's where the legislation's coming, which will help with the fabric of the buildings, but tech's where you really understand behaviours.
Yes, certainly, and I think there's even more opportunity ahead of us. And Nick was mentioned there about what does the future hold. We know that this kind of technology and the connection via Bluetooth or internet servers, can even start tracking how people behave within their domestic environment, in terms of leaving lights on or, falls, for example, detecting motionless people in buildings means that, other emergency services could be potentially called to assist. None of us want a big brother environment where we're worried about what we do in our own home environment, but there'll be certain circumstances where those people with frailty, this could really be of use. The kind of state we are, I think, now with technology is if you can think it, it can happen. It's just about having the commercial inertia behind it and the buy-in by certain key stakeholders, whether that's health or fire or, local authorities, to actually make these things happen.
I was reading the other day, Paul Jennings, I think, is from the London Fire Service. The Deputy Commissioner was complaining that house builders are gaming the system to avoid fire safety rules post Grenfell by making the high rises lower than 18 meters. I mean, it's not really the right attitude to have, is it? But that as an aside, Paul, it's a real challenge, isn't it? You have to do more with less, and it gives an idea of the problems with resourcing and how housing associations can kind of win the argument to invest in this tech.
I think the resources, two sides to it. There's the money is very tight. Obviously, all the money that we spend on people in the office, we're not spending on improvements to people's homes where they notice it the most. And I think the most significant, Sarah and I were talking earlier, is competence within the industry. It's the availability of skilled people who are able to do this stuff. So whatever we can install that kind of takes care of the low level or the lower risk items or the things that can be done by less competent people is great, because then it frees up the limited number of skilled competent people that we have to do the work where it's really needed, those complicated fire engineering elements of our buildings and stuff. So that's most significant for us, I think.
Nick, from your perspective, what's driving this change, and what needs to happen to, as Sarah said, build out this sort of golden thread of data for buildings?
Well, I don't think that there's one single system that's going to encompass so much information. If you look at the amount of data and the complexity of data, if you genuinely start from the planning of a building right through to the destruction of a building at the end of its life and all the maintenance that happens, it's got to be lots of systems knitting together, and that means lots of businesses have got to come to the fore, and they've got to be prepared to put their information into the system, and that will give that overall picture to the housing association to be able to be responsible and honestly, have that golden thread of information. But I can't see it'll come from one party.
I suppose one of the challenges here as well is that so many social housing buildings are very old as well, aren't they?
Yeah, if you look at the data, over 60% of the social housing in place in the UK today was built before 1980. So another big challenge is around how we do this work retrospectively, because if we just start with new build, we'll not get the job done in any of our lifetimes. So that gives a different challenge of how we get that information from existing buildings.
Jason, if I could come to you now, please. Give us a sense of what the Building Safety Bill will hopefully do.
Well, hopefully it will come on time. We're all hoping that it won't be a protracted process any more than we're waiting for. But hopefully what it will do will refocus the minds of those people that are responsible for buildings, in as much that when a building is conceived in terms of its initial purpose, right through to its design and then build, and then occupancy, we're going to hopefully see a system that is fixed, where one that has higher levels of engagement with stakeholders at an earlier stage. I'd really love to see more involvement at the planning stages of buildings, so that we can, through our engineering teams, work with the architects, the designers, the owners, all the way through the life cycle of that building to a point of somebody moving on the first day. So that prevents us then having to regulate the building in a way that actually creates more work for us. So the further upstream we can get in terms of designing, well, not us designing, but us working with the designers of the buildings to make sure that they're absolutely spot on in terms of safety, means that my limited resources that I have at my disposal are focused at the buildings that probably, as Nick said, the pre-1980s or higher risk buildings that need to be really focused on. We can actually put resources where they need to be.
Sarah, I mean, what do you hope the bill will bring, building on Jason's points?
I actually think there's been a significant step and culture change within the client-side organisations, so the people that are currently managing the buildings. What I'm not seeing at the moment is that significant culture shift in those who are developing, constructing and designing the buildings. So I'm hoping it's going to push that cultural change back down the supply chain to ensure that the risks to life are designed out at those preliminary stage, pre-occupation, and we as client organisations, responsible people at occupation aren't left to pick up the bill, as we have seen historically, in making sure that those buildings are safe when we're putting people into them, rather that they are safe at the design stage and then are constructed well, and we are getting the information to allow us to positively manage those buildings when people actually call them their homes.
It is coming across loud and clear the need for greater collaboration with all the sort of various stakeholders. Jason, what steps do you think need to be taken to improve that collaboration?
I think it's all built on relationships, isn't it? And knowing the right people to speak to. So, locally, we work with local authorities. We work with the local teams that go out and inspect buildings. So my teams work closely, but there's a lot of work to be done. And so, I'm always keen for other partners to come to us when they need assistance, rather than at the point where we have to come and regulate. And I think, today would be a great opportunity hopefully for me to make some more connections as well, because we need to scale things up. We can do things at a local level, and that's all well and good for local communities that maybe are more remote. But actually, when we can chunk this up to a higher level, we get far more impact in terms of a joint understanding, and it sounds like we've got very much that today. Yeah,
absolutely. I suppose it's been difficult, during the pandemic for vendors and fire and safety teams to go out and meet one another and talk and discuss with residents as well. Nick, how do you think we can kind of improve collaboration?
Well, I think the solutions industry, like our business, is a good example of the types of organisations that should be wading into this, because you take the concept of responsible person, and it was raised in the Fire Safety Act, and a lot of housing associations I've spoken to, find this a very worrying concept, that there has to be this responsible person. But as a solution provider, we've got to give that responsible person the information to allow them to be responsible without them engaging in a huge amount of administration. Nobody wants any more administration. So actually, not just in fire safety companies like FireAngel, but across the board, it's the responsibility of the providers of technology to give those solutions that can do a lot of that work for the responsible person. But that's where collaboration, adopting this concept of a golden thread, has to happen.
We're going to look now at the future and what the future of fire safety will look like, hopefully, and the steps to get there. But Paul, again, you've invested in this tech. What do you hope to achieve with this, and where's the sort of direction of travel?
So I think we've rolled this out across, or in the process of rolling this out across 14,000 homes at the moment. So we're starting to get some really good data back. We've already identified a number of people through the install process that had vulnerabilities that we were unaware of. I think so far.
Like what, for example?
I think we've found about 200 people that were deaf or hard of hearing, and weren't able to hear the smoke detectors going off in their own home. So as part of the install process, we've been able to install devices to assist them with that. So that's been helpful for the residents. It's enabled us to capture some more data. I think going forward, it's using this data set and looking to develop, I think we're discussing earlier on things like person-centred risk assessment tools and maybe apps. So we're collecting one set of resident data, we're collecting information about those residents when we go into their homes to install the smoke alarms, perhaps picking up some other things around the condition of their health that enables us to then signpost other services, talked about the ambulance service or social services perhaps, to really get involved and look after that person in their home and keep them comfortable.
I think if you're installing these devices, it's probably a good opportunity to engage with and educate. Are you finding that?
We are, and I think as part of our install process, the engineer is required to do this detailed handover and talk to the resident about testing the alarms and what happens when the alarms go off, and some basic fault finding, and introducing the resident to the app that comes with the system as well. So not every resident has taken us up on that, but those that have said it's really useful. We've got some carers, some family members of some of our more vulnerable residents have also then opted to download the app, and they can keep an eye on perhaps the testing regime of smoke detectors in their parents' houses, and get a better understanding of how they're living.
Just thinking about an ageing population, the World Health Organization says that between 2015 and 2050, the percentage of the world's population over 60 will nearly double to 22%. I suppose most of those will be, digitally savvy, but is there a problem at the moment with an ageing population? Jason, I don't know, of people dealing with technology or perhaps not being able to make the most of these innovations?
Yeah, well, I suppose it'd be wrong for me to give you anything factual, but from my experience, it's not just confined to the elderly. There is digital exclusion for people of all ages. For example, during the lockdowns, we were running Prince's Trust courses for young people who didn't have devices to access the internet. So we provided them with laptops. So although there's greater vulnerability in older people, I don't necessarily think that they'll be digitally excluded perhaps in the future. As you say, as we all grow older, we'll all still have phones stuck to our hands, I'm sure, and we'll be far more comfortable with technology being around us. But currently we have to do impact assessments on how we engage with all communities, and we have to take that into consideration, absolutely, and not assume that everyone's going to be as happy with technology as perhaps my children are. And so we have to look at other ways of conveying information and access to services. So I think the challenge for me as a fire officer is to create those networks and those relationships with housing providers, so that we can go and do that face-to-face second round of information. I'm really glad to hear that there's that first step being taken at point of occupancy, and the responsibility being held by the people that are the landlord effectively. That's great to hear, but we know that there's a need to embed that education to change behaviours, and we're conscious that sometimes you have to go back and reinforce that message to make sure that the behaviours have changed such that people are safer.
I think it's great. I think what I really liked about Paul's answer was that this data is identifying those spots, the blind spots, really. But Nick, just trying to understand the process of when you innovate and produce these products, what's the sort of process? I suppose you want to make it as intuitive and as easy to use as possible.
Yeah, I think I'm a product designer by background, and the difference between product designers and engineers historically is we start from the human and the need perspective rather than from what the technology can do. And we have at our disposal amazing technology now, and I just look at the 20-year history of the business and how the technology is used, to even using AI technology today. It's amazing, but if you lose sight of the end user on that journey, I think you'll lose out. And I think the two areas that are so important is, one, you look at the users and you look at the human aspects of the technology. And secondly, you always plan for the very long run and work backwards, because if you're aiming in the right direction, it will mean as you go on that journey, it will be easier to develop the technology and it will stay relevant for longer.
Sarah, thinking about what else we might see in the near future, you mentioned asset tagging before, misting. Maybe there's an opportunity for more misting rather than sprinklers, and QR codes as well.
Yeah, so obviously post-Grenfell, a lot of organisations are looking at the retrofitting of sprinkler systems within high-rise buildings. There are a number of mist products that are coming to the market, but I think there's a lot of room within that space to develop systems for residential purposes. A couple of years back now, we saw the British standard on mist systems come forward. I think there's a bit of a gap in the market that could be developed further in that area. I think certainly from a resident perspective, a lot of the feedback we get is that there's a preference from a resident's perspective on mist systems rather than sprinkler systems. I think residents still kind of think of sprinkler systems as the die-hard, the whole deluge system goes off and everywhere gets flooded. So I think it would potentially open more doors to present more mist systems in the marketplace. QR code and digital data transfer is something, again, that's starting to open up. Obviously, as we move into the Building Safety Act and the Fire Safety Act as well, there is a need to transfer data to fire and rescue services to help operational response. We don't want to be, as a sector, in a position where we're having to maintain hard copy records across some 3,000 buildings in England and Wales. So we need to look at how we can get and maintain and share that data digitally with those that need to use it. And I think at the moment that is something that the sector and government are still working through about how the best way to do that. And I think digital transfer of data using QR codes or similar technologies is something that certainly we can start to look at and potentially take the benefit from.
And I'm sure from a fire and safety perspective, Jason, I was amazed by that stat that said that 40% of call-outs last year were false alarms, essentially. So hopefully with better data and more sensors, you won't need to go out as often and you can sort of focus your resources more.
Yeah, I mean, the figure you quote, it wouldn't be unusual across all fire and rescue services in terms of what we call unwanted fire signals. So there's a slight difference between that and the false alarm. So, you know, when we're called out to a system that's actuated because of some burnt toast, that's not unwanted because there's potential for a fire. The unwanted fire signals are the ones where, you know, somebody's broken a call point or by a door, or there's a system fault. And that consumes a lot of our time. And so, you know, systems that can be developed in the future that are more robust, better understood by the people that manage them, and are better maintained would make everybody's life a lot easier. Having said that, you know, when we look at responding appropriately, a number of fire and rescue services don't respond to certain call types, for example, because we're relying on the technology because of what it can tell us and what it can convey to control rooms. And again, the opportunities for how that information, that data is shared in the future, who knows where it will take us in terms of the speed to control rooms or to other places where we can manage that information quickly.
Well, as you said earlier, I mean, the goal here is prevention. Is there a sort of sense of frustration that perhaps, you know, there isn't the sort of referral pathways that perhaps, I don't know, healthcare has in the fire and safety industry? Yeah,
so, you know, the legislation that exists for us to regulate buildings is very robust. It's being amended, as Sarah's mentioned a couple of times, you know, for the better. In terms of private dwellings, we have no legal precedent to cross the threshold unless there's an emergency. And so we do that through referral pathways or through our own means by going out and meeting the public and identifying those that are vulnerable from fire. So we heavily rely on upstream referrals from agencies such as health, ambulance service, housing providers, or anybody that can, at point of access, can speak to that individual and say, we think, you know, you'd benefit from a visit from the fire and rescue service. You know, can we pass on your details? Again, handling data, we know how that sometimes can be quite prohibitive. And so working with other partners and having data handling agreements is really important. And when there's that common will, it's relatively easier to manage to get to the end point, which is my crews or crews from other fire and rescue services turning up at the front door, engaging directly with that individual, their family, and the family if they're looking after somebody that's vulnerable, and talking to them in their home environment about, you know, what are the hazards, not only from fire, but keeping well in the home environment. So falls prevention is something we look at. And then we can refer people in communities onto other agencies from that visit. So if the referral hasn't come from health, it might have come from a member of the family, but we might think there's a safeguarding issue here or there's a health issue and we can refer them on for further assistance. So when you kind of build it as you go forward in that timeline, it cumulatively makes that person safer.
At the top I said that we had about 250 fatalities in fire in the year to June 2021. Can we get it? How are we going to get it down to zero? Do you think, Nick? Do we need to have more of a vision? Do you think? Set goals.
I think we've seen fire deaths in the UK reduced by over 50% in the last 20 years. So fantastic progress has been made. The challenge is, as you say, keeping that trajectory. And I think with a lot of the challenges that we've got, particularly ageing population and with that higher percentage of vulnerable people, I've picked up a sense within the industry of, there will be a plateau, and I think we need to focus on getting to zero. I know that's a very, very challenging vision, but it's important that we don't accept that there's going to be a plateauing. So technology has got the potential to help give that insight, to help understand where the risk is, to help protect that risk, to drive us in that direction. So I think the most important thing is not giving up on that long-term vision and keeping that downward trajectory going.
Great. And last few minutes now, I think. Paul, if what advice would you give to other housing associations about the kind of steps they need to take to reach this,
I think for me, it's question why you're doing what you're doing, and don't do it because you've always done it that way. That's been our starting point, and some difficult conversations with colleagues around standards and the type of detectors we're installing and how we're installing them. We've really looked at the in Ealing's case, the process around not screwing the things to the ceiling, we're nailing them. We've done some tests to avoid damaging asbestos. It's really that whole process, and for us, it's resulted in being able to install the highest levels of smoke detection in every property in the borough, and get this kind of the IoT bolt on, if you like, for free. That's been cost neutral. We've been, and off the back of that, some of the infrastructure that we have installed to these systems has meant that we can also do upgrades to things like door entry systems. The knock on from that is we've been able to put tablets into people's homes, which we can also use for messaging in an emergency. It's I think creating that time to pause, to look at why we're doing what we're doing, rather than how we've always done it, and then moving forward from there, and not being afraid to ask questions. There is lots of good practice going on within the industry, but at the moment it isn't shared, and I think there's an over-reliance on contractors who aren't always forthcoming with new ideas because it might impact how they work. But picking up the phone and asking others how they've done it and collaborating, really.
That's great. And Sarah, what sort of advice would you give as well?
I think I'd second that. I think it's about taking the time now to look externally to your organisation and going out to the marketplace and understanding the type of systems and the benefits that they will deliver to your organisation, and taking that more holistic and longer term approach. It's not just about when we're building new stock now, it's about when we're retrofitting the stock that's coming to the end of functional life, looking at your capital programme delivery and looking at the opportunities to improve safety long term, but also sustainability while we're there, because they're not mutually exclusive. A lot of the technology now is going to deliver safety benefit while improving data, but also has the opportunity to deliver sustainability improvements and savings as well.
And Jason, I mean, same sort of question, but it's coming across that people do need to make that step and invest in tech and look to the future, because legislation's here or incoming, let's say, and it's only going to tighten things up. So it's not a matter of if they're going to invest, it's sort of when, isn't it?
Hopefully, yeah. And I think Paul and Ealing Borough Council are setting the precedent and showing that it can be done. And I'd love to see all sort of local authorities and housing providers using this type of technology, because it's an investment now, and as Sarah says, you have to think about capital investment programs and what does that money today mean you can't do tomorrow, but actually what does it mean for the future in terms of the estate that you own, also the people that were going to reside in that building. But I hope that in the future the technology we've been talking about and that will evolve over the future years will become commonplace. And we'll use it to our advantage, whether that's technology that allows you to switch on your heating from your phone right through to, really understanding vulnerability in communities at an earlier stage. So we're not going to speak to people when they're 65, 70, 75. We're actually speaking to them at an earlier stage and really reinforcing that messaging and, keeping communities safe and keeping them well.
And finally, Nick, and any sort of reflections on the conversation we've had? I mean, I think it's clear that more collaboration is needed, and as Jason said, hopefully things like this will help the process.
Yeah, I think it's all about attitude. It's about taking that long-term view, taking a holistic view, and if you do that effectively and you understand the technology that's available to you, as Paul has proved at Ealing, you can actually work a lot more cost effectively and have a higher level of technology than you anticipated within your existing budget. And also you can build an infrastructure which then can have additional pieces of technology added to it. So you might start out with a fire system, but then looking more broadly at other important factors like the environment within the property, things like temperature and humidity, onto things like boiler control. Once you've taken that first step, if you've planned it for the long run, it's a lot more cost effective to add those technologies there, so you get the best outcome and actually you get it in the most cost effective way.
I think that's a really lovely point to end on there. It's clear that, you know, more collaboration's needed, but hopefully this is, you know, events like this will help improve those processes. I've had a fascinating discussion, so thank you all for sharing your experience and insights. I hope the viewers enjoyed it as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to my panelists.